Hey, good morning, everybody. Boker Tov, as we say in the Hebrew.
I didn't get some announcement that the video for Shabbat was previewing on Friday, so I just watched it a little while ago, and it's almost the best one you've had. It was amazing.
You're talking about last Friday?
Yeah, this past Friday. Usually it shows up on my phone that you're
Oh, yeah.
it didn't, I couldn't find it until now.
Well, it was the Shabbat song, right? It was Shabbat. It was the Shabbat Shirah. And we're working with some, actually I had a 3-hour conversation with Josh Nelson on Sunday, not even during the week. And Josh is doing some really great music and is going to do some more great music. And JLTV is broadcasting it, but I'm going to post a link to our Facebook page. Cantor Mike Stein, our friend from Temple Aliyah in the Valley, he is putting together something called the Jewish Disability Shabbat. And that's going to be, it's Shabbat Miracles, and it's all young people, and I'm not sure how old, the oldest it is, all people who are living with various types of learning issues, and it's for it's for Disability Awareness Month, and so it's a Shabbat called Shabbat Miracles, and we're going to post a link to it. So I've been working with, I'm doing very little other than putting it up on JLTV and making sure that it can air, but it's a project of the Jewish Community Foundation here in LA and the Jewish Federation. So we're hoping it'll have a good national resonance for Jewish disability awareness. So very, very excited about that. And that'll air 8 o'clock. So 5 o'clock and 8 o'clock our time, Western, I should say. For Jeff Stein, who's on right now, that's Pacific time. So I'm really excited about that. I don't know what to expect, but I expect always great things from Mike Stein and family. And it's not just him as cantor. There's other cantors who are participating. So as we're waiting for everybody to come on, I'll tell you, it's called Shabbat Miracles, Celebrate Jewish Disability Awareness and Inclusion Month, with a special Shabbat led by Chazan Mike Stein and Elaine Hall, founder of and artistic director of the Miracle Project, leader in neurodiversity, inclusion, and belonging. Featuring singers
the first time I ever
with
saw
and without disabilities. This diverse, creative, and interactive Friday night service will bring the joy and warmth of Shabbat to your home. We will celebrate how we are all B'Tselem Elohim, created in God's image. So I can't wait to see. I haven't seen it yet, but I can't wait to see it. So thank you, Diane, for allowing me some time to talk about Shabbat, and very importantly, what's happening. It's not this Shabbat, it's the 12th. It's the Shabbat of Valentine's President's Day weekend, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, anyways, it's going to be tough too. It's my dad's birthday, February 12th. He was born on my dad was born on Lincoln's birthday, and my mom was born on Kennedy's birthday. Isn't that weird?
And it's also the day Mary gets her second shot. So it's second shot Shabbat.
Well, that's awesome, Mary. I won't be at the same place as you, but I'm getting my second. That'll also be my second shot Shabbat, and it's
very good.
And I'm getting it later than I'd like. I'm getting it. I think the earliest they could do the shot was at 5 o'clock. I said I couldn't explain to the pharmacist that's way close to Shabbat, but it's okay. The important thing is get it done, and I'm hoping that everybody will be able to get it done in the coming days.
I gotta wait till about April or May.
They've still told you that. Well, I'm keeping my ears open for you, Mike. If I hear anything that's legitimate, I'll let you know. They're
No, but that place down in San Fernando, if you were over 65, they were taking you. If you were a healthcare worker, they were taking you, appointment or no appointment.
Even without an appointment?
Yep. Even without an appointment, they were taking you near the end of the day.
So they had extra, right?
So anybody that needs a shot in the San Fernando Valley, just go to the county in San Fernando.
And from what I understand, it's being run by the fire department, right, Mike?
Yes, it is. All fire department people are there.
So it's at the San Fernando Fire, administered by them. It's at the Park 208
on Park Avenue, yeah.
And it's in San Fernando. So unfortunately, again, we had heard that they were doing it for people under 65, but
No.
I think you know, I think it kind of just depends on the person on the day. You hear stories about people getting vaccinated, you know, on the freeway if they've, you know, that breakdown start. There's just weird stuff happening. I hope that it's not like that soon. But I know some people that went to Dodger Stadium too. They were actually there when the chaos happened last week. So that was embarrassing. And
But see, if Tommy was still alive, he would have made sure those protesters got out of the way.
Tommy, or maybe Tommy's spirit rained down on them. Gosh, it's good to see everybody today.
Rabbi Mark,
Yeah,
we're talking about Cantor
Mike,
from,
Mike Stein.
sorry, yeah.
Mike Stein. Yeah.
Years ago, the Autry did this amazing program. It was right before Passover, and they had several cantors, and he was one of them. And we spoke to him afterwards. I mean, this goes back many years. And then several times we went to see some of his special services because, you know, he does a jazz one, he does
Bluegrass.
Friday nights, and
Bluegrass.
it's really cool. Yeah.
Well, if you watch our Friday night services, not last Friday night, but the Friday before, we had him and his family singing Shalom Rav. They do a great Shalom Rav, which they actually wrote. And so you'll occasionally see them at our service. We did a service with them back in June on JLTV, and we actually aired it at the temple too that weekend. But yeah, you'll see them. I was happy with the way the sound came out. I was not happy with the lighting of that service. That's why I don't show it more. So we'll do a new one this year. But it's been crazy, you know. The synagogues are trying to figure out how to keep things different, and I don't know. Reverend Linton, how are the churches doing? How are at least the Episcopal churches doing right now?
Well, it's interesting. Yesterday was Monday. Sunday, there was a conversation between Ken Chasen and Mike Kinman. And as a matter of fact, Rabbi Chasen was the preacher at that service. And so they were talking about exactly that, you know, how do you do this given the circumstances? And their concern was this is becoming the new normal. And both congregations are growing online, as I assume Bethany is, but what happens afterward? What happens when we go back to the way it used to be? You know, how much of this can be carried over positively?
Yeah.
Ken Chasen used to be with
Yeah, he was our student
he was our
rabbi.
student rabbi.
He was a student rabbi at Bethany years ago.
Right.
He went back east, and then
His music is wonderful.
Yeah, he came back.
The sermon was good too.
Leo Beck about 15 years ago to Leo Beck. So yeah, Leo Beck congregation, by the way, for those who are, that's the one up by the Getty. That's the Getty uses their parking lot, or used to use their parking
That's the one that almost burnt down, right? A couple years ago. Got real close.
Right.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, we've been talking about plagues for the last month. I can't wait to get out of the plagues, especially since we're living through a plague right now. It was really kind of like the plagues. At first they were you know, kind of just hoping that you missed out on it, and you know, we're going to get through this quickly. And then it was, you know, Passover time. We were saying, oh, next Passover, we're going to all be free. We'll be liberated. And yeah, it's not happening.
No.
So, and it is interesting because according to at least the way we read the Midrash, the plagues in Egypt happened over a year. The way that the Midrash explains it, each plague lasted about a week, but the buildup for each plague lasted 3 weeks. So part of the plague itself was the anticipation and dread of the plague, and then the plague would last about a week. So 10 plagues comes out to about 10 months. It's better part of a year. So we're coming to about that time right about now, 10 months. And actually we're past that now, I guess you can make the argument. But so there is definitely a lot of resonance this year with studying this. It was the Torah portion, as we talked about. We've moved on. Last week we crossed the Sea of Reeds, so we're further along in the Torah reading. But I have immersed myself in Exodus this year because it feels really powerfully relevant, not just because of the plagues, but I think also the discussions and the importance of freedom in our story. And that's why I shared that article yesterday from the Wall Street
It's a
Journal.
wonderful article. I've shared it with lots of people. It's just terrific.
Yeah, and that guy, Leon Cass, who wrote that, professor for many years at University of Chicago, wrote a great book on a book on Genesis. He's now written a book on Exodus. Great professor. And I thought he really summed up some things that we've learned and taught over the years about Exodus as a book, because it's really about the whole story of Exodus. And then just do a little commercial. I mentioned before, this is my professor's book, The Exodus by Richard Elliott Friedman. I don't know why it took me a couple years to read this. I used to read his books whenever they came out, and I guess it's not him, it's me. I'm not reading as much. This came out in 2017. It's a really, really great explanation of the writers of Exodus. Why is Exodus so important? Friedman is really the preeminent scholar on who wrote the Bible. That's his book, Who Wrote the Bible. It was a bestseller, and really was a bestseller. It was one of the best-selling biblical studies books of all time. He's a great writer, very readable, very funny, lots of popular cultural references. He was a great professor too. He taught that way. Even though he believes in the authorship of the Bible, and he'll explain and actually show you how the authorship is relevant in the book of Exodus, he does believe that an Exodus happened. So unlike and he talks about that, some of the professors, teachers, rabbis over the years who've kind of said that Exodus didn't happen, he believes absolutely it happened, and he believes that the proof for it is actually in the Bible, to some extent in the Bible itself, which is a tough claim to make, to use the text to prove it, but he does it in a really interesting way.
Proof texting.
Yeah, and I would definitely recommend it if you're interested in that question of whether the Exodus happened. And again, it's got some important stuff about the whole book of the Exodus, which led me to then, because I was on Amazon, get one of his last books too, which he co-wrote with a professor, Shauna Delansky, who's a professor at Northeastern University, assistant professor of religious studies. So they wrote this book called Bible Now, which is his work on and her work on what the Torah teaches us about contemporary issues like abortion, women's status, capital punishment, the earth. So he really, talks in this book about like, what does the Bible really say, rather than what people say it says. And so it's an interesting, like if you want to know where in the Bible does it talk about this, it's really not about interpretation. It's about like, what does it say? And, kind of leaves it to people to interpret. So that's the Bible Now. And I do want to say, in the midst of reading Midrash, and we're going to be getting to some of, well, they're always there, but they're not as prevalent in the last couple of weeks. It was a few weeks ago. Is this wonderful book that I got from Reverend Lynn, Womanist Midrash by Wilda Gaffney, which is another great book that is trying to recover and make us kind of give life and give word to women of the Bible, of the Torah. So it's a really interesting issue. Thought about it a little bit last week with the Song of Miriam, Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea. it's an interesting situation because the Bible says that the people sang the song, and then it does quite specifically say that Miriam and the women sang and danced to the song. This is a question of whose song it is, maybe, but there is no question that at some point Miriam sang that song. And what I think is interesting about that is that, and Friedman talks about it as well, for people who study biblical authorship, the Song of the Sea is universally considered, and I'd say almost universally considered, the oldest chapter 15 in the text. So when people try to figure out what are like the core pieces of the text that existed the earliest, the Song of the Sea is seen as the oldest one. And what's interesting about that is that and Friedman makes the point, but it's also traditional. The Haftarah, the section of the prophets that we read last week, right? The section that is read as the companion piece to the Torah, to that Torah portion, is the Song of Deborah, which is another song, right? It's a song of victory and a song of God's power, but it's also a song of a woman. It's a woman's song. And the rabbis caught that a long time ago. So when they assigned Haftarot, they assigned that one for the Song of the Sea. So again, you can make the argument they're songs of victory, they're songs, and that by itself makes them connected. But the fact that they're also songs attributed to women is pretty significant. And the fact that traditionally we recognize that, we match those up. And they're interesting and Friedman points out, from what they tell us about the origin stories of the Israelites themselves, who's mentioned in those songs, who's not mentioned in those songs, and what those songs can kind of tell us about our history. So that's in his Exodus book, but it's also in Jewish tradition, right? It's the fact that we've sung those Haftarot together for thousands of years. So when we talk about the plagues, and we're going to finish today, I promise there'll be no more plagues.
Rabbi, you going to go on Facebook?
Yeah, or there's not going to be, thank you. There's not going to be any more plagues after today. That's not exactly true, but
There's some in the later on. I remember.
We're done with this section of plagues. It's important to understand why do we have so much about the plagues in the Torah? Why do we have so much about the plagues in the Midrash? Some of it might be obvious to you, but let's just say a couple things. The Torah tells us why these plagues are so important. They're to teach the Egyptians a lesson. It says that a few times, so that Pharaoh and the Egyptians will know my power. That is explicitly said. That's not my commentary on it. It's not someone else's commentary on it. The Torah says, so Pharaoh and the Egyptians will know my power. It also explicitly says, so that the Israelites will know my power. Those things are said explicitly. There's also, I think, a couple of, maybe now these are the implicit messages, which is that the Israelites and the rest of the world should know that this is what I'm capable of as God, right? These are cautionary tales. And so it's a cautionary tale for us as people who read the Bible. It's also a cautionary tale for anybody who hears about God, that God does these kinds of things, and that God works this way, and that those things are out there. The Torah does explicitly say that the Israelites shouldn't have these plagues visited on them. So it's not just that they heard about it, know about it, and are amazed by it a long time ago, but so that they don't get these plagues later. And the Torah does say that. So that is explicit, that this is a cautionary tale. There's another interesting thing, which again so this is maybe, again, more of an interpretation or where we can go from this. I think there's this issue that the Torah kind of gives us here, which is, does God pick and choose who gets punished? Now, if you think that that's obvious, just remember, when the Torah begins in Genesis, God works on a macro level. God creates the universe, creates the planets, our planet, creates life. And then God almost destroys life. But God is working on a macro level. He saves a family, so gets a family on the ark. But there's really a question of, does God pick and choose individuals? I mean, Noah's saved miraculously, but he uses what God tells him to be saved from a destruction that otherwise he would have been destroyed with. Now, in the plagues, we get individuals who literally get targeted by the plagues, namely the Egyptians. And this shows that God, yes, can indeed pick and choose people and take them out fairly specifically. And we see in Genesis God doing miracles on a local level, on a personal level. The first real miracles are on a personal level are really Sarah being able to have a child. That's God acting on one person. And that, you can make the argument, is the first miracle done on a local level, on a personal level. And so we are left with a God who can work on an individual micro level, which, look, that's still arguably the biggest theological question that we have, which is, does God act? Does God care about? Does God act on one person? And I think we still deal with that question every day. And when we're dealing with that right now, can God protect me? Can God help me if I don't get sick? Is that a miracle? People still ask those questions. We still ask those questions ourselves. So the plagues are actually arguably the place where we get this big question: does God work on an individual level, and does God care about one person or one group, or again, one house? Because we're going to read, when the plague passes over a house, that's a pretty micro level of God working, and the plagues give us that. So that might be one of the biggest.
It's always been an issue for me.
Yeah, this might be I don't want to say the biggest lesson of the plagues, because the plagues have, who am I to say what the biggest lesson is, but definitely thought about it this year, because thousands of years later, I'm still, and I'm completely honest about this. I'm praying, I'm hoping, I'm doing what a lot of other people, I won't say everybody's doing, but really wondering, does it matter? Does God care about me getting sick or not? And is that, on a level when some people are getting sick and other people aren't getting sick? It's not.
Well, my husband and I joke about that in a very peculiar way. We say, thank God I got the parking space. Too bad he didn't take care of the starving children.
Yeah.
I find it a terrible problem.
It is. And it comes to the
I don't have an answer.
I don't either. It comes for I'm glad you're as in the dark about
count
this.
on you guys to have the answers.
But I will tell you this: I've never thought about it.
No, just lots more questions.
Yeah, and I never thought about.
I was told, is not the keeper of the answers, but the keeper of the questions.
Yeah, never thought about it more than this year. That I'll tell you. It's never been on my mind more than it has been, because I think about it almost every day. Every time I put on a mask, that's essentially the bracha that I'm saying. Please, I don't want to get sick today. And again, that's after thousands of years of science and genetics and rational thought and everything else. I've never thought about it more frequently than I have over this last year. So let's take a look at said plagues and where we left off. And again, apologize for last week, but we were talking about the plagues that were brought on by Moses. And we read some versions of the plagues that, again, kind of talk about them all. Now we get the plagues kind of, we go through we go through another version of a recounting of them, the way that Ginsburg did it, by kind of rehashing them in a slightly different way. Again, I will pop it up here for all to see. And Rosemary, would you like to take it for us today?
Okay. I just want to make
Again,
no, you did.
we're kind of like halfway through the plagues, where we left off this second round of listing them. And so now this is Moses still confronting Pharaoh with these plagues. So here we go.
Pharaoh had observed that whenever he walked on the brink of the Nile, Moses would intercept him. He therefore gave up his morning walk. God bade Moses seek the king in his palace in the early hours of the day and urge him to repent of his evil ways. Therefore, Moses spoke to him as follows in the name of God. "Oh, you villain, you think that I cannot destroy you from the world? Consider, if I had desired it, instead of smiting the cattle, I might have smitten you and your people with the pestilence, and you would have been cut off from the earth. I inflicted the plague only in such degree as was necessary to show you my power, and that my name may be declared throughout all the earth. But you do not leave off treading my people underfoot. Behold, tomorrow, when the sun passes this point," whereat Moses made a stroke upon the wall, "I will cause a very grievous hail to pour down, such as will only be once more when I annihilate God with hail, fire, and brimstone."
Yeah, so that's a little reference to the Gog and Magog battle of the end times. So that kind of tells you when this was written, because it was written after people were talking about apocalyptic battles. And yeah, there'll be hail again, and it'll be really bad. So now we're at the plague of Barad. Now, what's interesting about this, of course, is that the plague of hail is a 1-2 punch with the locusts, as we're going to see. But what was interesting about it is that it's also connected to the previous plagues, because, well, they all connected. But here we have this wonderful line that the plague that killed the cows could have killed people and, well, livestock. The reason is the word dever, which is the word for plague or pestilence. It's different than the word for the plagues, but it's the pestilence. It would be the plague. It would be disease. That's the word that we would use for like what we're dealing with now, a dever, a plague. What's interesting is that the plague clearly was one that hit livestock. The Midrash here tells us, yeah, and it could have hit people too if I wanted it to. That's what God says. But I didn't. And yet, of course, you didn't learn from that one. But there's this understanding that like an unseen plague that only kills the livestock, something like that can kill people too. And it's interesting that they knew about that in the ancient world, even though they didn't understand about viruses and bacteria and things like that. They did know that pestilence, disease spread by things that we can't see, is a serious and scary thing, whether it hits animals or it hits people. That's a little too close to home, but that's what the Midrash is telling us, is that dever was really, and we have it in the Haggadah, by the way. If you read the Haggadah really closely, it talks about how that plague, the 5th plague, was like God's full hand, is actually the Midrash that's in the Haggadah, that God hit the Egyptians with a full hand, all 5 fingers, with the plague of dever. And of course, it gets back to the apocalypse, which is pestilence, fire and brimstone, all of those things, the 4 horsemen, if you will. We get that in the rabbinic texts too, that all of those things are parts of the final destruction that will happen to humanity in that day, that scary day. All right. Keep going.
Okay. But God's loving kindness is so great that even in his wrath, he has mercy upon the wicked. And as his chief object was not to injure men and beasts, but to damage the vegetation in the fields of the Egyptians, he bade Moses admonish Pharaoh to send and hasten in his cattle and all that he had in the field. But the warning fell on heedless ears. Job was the only one to take it to heart, while Pharaoh and his people regarded not the word of the Lord. Therefore the Lord let the hail smite both man and beast, instead of confining it to the herbs and the trees of the field, as he had intended from the first.
Yeah, and that's an interesting midrash based on the fact that originally it says the hail would affect just the plants, the vegetation, and then it does say that it hit other people. Of course, it goes back to the midrash, with the bigger midrash, that Job was one of those wise men who is one of the better courtiers. But there was three of them, if you remember. Job was in between. Balaam is the really bad one, and then the good one is Yitro. So those three Gentile wise people, the three wise men who attended Pharaoh's court, Job here, Yitro's already gone, right? Yitro already got out when they were killing babies. Job is still there, but trying to be the voice of reason. And Balaam is there egging the Pharaoh on the whole time. So Job goes through his punishments later on, as we talked about to some extent, because in the book of Job, because he was, after all, one of Pharaoh's courtiers. He's good compared to the other courtiers, but he's still like not totally good, which is why he can be punished as a lesson, if you will. It's kind of, why is Job picked? Well, because he was one of Pharaoh's courtiers. It's weird, but that's the logic. That's what you get with this. Why Job? Also, of course, it kind of is weird because the Midrash seems to forget that we're going to get the plagues are happening. Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He doesn't really have a choice, but there is a choice. And it seems as though Pharaoh could have changed his mind. It's weird. It's almost like we're supposed to forget that Pharaoh can, and believe that Pharaoh can jump off at any given time. I don't know what to tell you other than there is this somehow idea that Pharaoh could do the right thing and stop this from happening, even as we're keep hearing over and over again that his heart is hardened. It's a very weird issue that kind of goes back to this idea that we don't like, and when I say we, the rabbis don't like the idea that Pharaoh doesn't really have choice in the matter. They don't like it. And so they almost willingly ignore the fact that this has all been set up to go 10 rounds anyways. I mean, that's the problem. It's been set up to go 10 rounds. I like that analogy. I don't think I've ever used that before. He's got to go 10 rounds and he's got to get beaten up every round. But he's not allowed to go down before the 10th round. So there you go. I don't know what movie that's in, but that's fine. It's not really Rocky, but it's a boxing analogy. All right. So, but that's what you just read, that Pharaoh maybe could have gotten off. All right, here we go.
Now, at last, Pharaoh acknowledged and said, "The Lord is righteous, and I and my people are wicked. He was righteous when he bade us hasten in our cattle from before the hail. And I and my people were wicked, for we heeded not his warning. And men and beasts were found in the field by the hail and slain." Again, he begged Moses to supplicate God in his behalf, that he turn the plague away. And he promised to let the children of Israel go. Moses consented to do his will, saying, however, "Think not that I do not know what will happen after the plague is stayed. I know that you and your servants, you will fear the Lord God once his punishment is removed, as little as you feared him before. But to show his greatness, I will pray to him to make the hail to cease." I've lost you.
Yeah, sorry, sound. Yeah, sorry. You read that last
I
line.
need you to scroll.
Yeah, okay. Oh, shouldn't.
Well, I've got Moses went a short distance in the second sentence after that, and then I'm done.
Me too.
Oh. Okay. Well, no, that's too far.
Well, I just said, make the hail to cease, and then
Oh,
there's
okay.
more
It's
lines.
weird. On mine, it shows it's in the middle. All right. Is
Oh,
that where-
you froze again.
is it better now?
Nope.
No.
Okay, hold it a second. There we go. How's that?
Same. Oh, there it goes.
Okay. All right.
Now it's all blurry. There. Moses went a short distance out of the city from Pharaoh and spread abroad his hands to the Lord, for he did not desire to pray to God within, where there were many idols and images. At once the hail remained suspended in the air. Part of it dropped down while Joshua was engaged in battle with the Amorites, and the rest God will send down in his fury against Gog. Also, the thunders ceased at Moses' intercession and were stored up for a later time, for they were the noise which the Lord made the hosts of the Syrians to hear at the siege of Samaria, wherefore they arose and fled in the twilight.
Yeah. So this miracle of the hail ceasing was not just it stopped, that this hail stopped and that everything was good. No, it was much more dramatic than that, in the sense that in the heavens, it stopped where it was midway as it was coming down, and is there for later on miracles when God would use it against the Amorites, the Canaanites, when Joshua was leading the forces against in the book of Joshua against them, against the Canaanites. And then also you can see the sound of the thunder is also going to scare the Syrian armies when they're fighting against Samaria during the book of Kings. We read those stories. So these plagues and miracles are being stored up. Moses only used, or God only used half of them, if you will, and is storing up the other half for later. This kind of goes with this idea that God only has a certain amount of stuff that he's got there. For the most part, it kind of goes with, it starts with this idea that God doesn't usually do things like this. God puts everything into motion and doesn't act supernaturally. God doesn't do that. But that God did create these miracles at the beginning, right? We say at the twilight of the last day of creation, that God, just before the end of the sixth day, God creates all these things that will be used up later. And once they're used up, that's it. They're used up, and we don't see them again. So these miracles, if you will, these supernatural things, God created them at the beginning, meaning that they're created to be used at a certain time. And if they're not used up, then wouldn't really make sense for God to have created them. So this is sometimes they get reused, or they don't stop. Their power is stored up for a later time if they can be connected to another plague or miracle. I think the most, the unique one that we've actually looked at before a little bit is Balaam's donkey. The talking donkey was created at the beginning like this, just for the reason of being able to talk to Balaam, because donkeys are not supposed to talk. So that donkey was created at the last moment of creation. And then, of course, that donkey does not really go away. Some people believe that that's the donkey that carries the Messiah in. Other people say that that donkey died, but never lost its power. That jawbone of an ass that Samson picks up and kills all those Philistines with is indeed that same talking donkey whose mouth and jawbone are so miraculous that they could never really ever go away. So those are those are interesting ideas of God's miracles that, again, that never go away, because God created them for a purpose, and they have a shelf life maybe, but it's more that once they're put into power, you got to use them. So that's what happens with this hail, that it actually stops. And that in itself is a miracle. So
I'm sort of reminded of my mom, because she always carried a Tupperware when she went out to eat. Remember when we used to go out to eat? And she would put in a little bit for later.
yeah, well, she stored up. She knew that there was time coming where she might need that.
Right.
Yeah, that's that kind of getting good use of God's creations, if you will, but especially God's special creations that really are only used on a limited basis. By the way, I mean, there's an idea behind it, which is that, yeah, God doesn't do these kinds of things normally. And when they're done, they were baked into the system. And so that's why they're there, because they were always there, which is, again, like, the stuff works like clockwork, and it happens when it happens. And it don't think that God just said, oh, I'm doing that now. No, it was always going to happen, and this is the way it's going to happen. I mean, you'll see it in a couple of sessions, that God created the lanes in the Red Sea for the Israelites to walk through, that those lanes were created at the beginning of creation underneath the Red Sea, just ready for that moment. All right.
It's sort of God's economy.
Yeah, you could say that, but it's also, again, this kind of hope that God doesn't work willy-nilly, that God doesn't wake up one day and go, yeah, today's the day that I'm going to destroy them. And so it's a part of kind of like a foreshadow or predestination, actually, right? And it's also maybe this idea that, again, God doesn't act irrationally and supernaturally. So it's those rationalists like Maimonides, or even before that Philo, who were kind of Aristotelian in their belief that God, yeah, there's a God and God makes things, but God doesn't. It's also the God of Newton. God doesn't just play around. So people like that. There are people who like that. They don't like a precarious and unstructured.
Well, it makes God seem less arbitrary.
Yeah. Yep. All right. So Pharaoh does beg for the hail to stop and says, I'm going to let the people go. That was one of the things that makes that plague different, was just stop it, Moses. I'll let the people go.
As Moses had foreseen, so it happened. No sooner had this hail stopped than Pharaoh abandoned his resolve and refused to let Israel go. Moses lost no time in announcing the 8th plague to him, the plague of the locusts. Observing that his words had made an impression upon the king's counselors, he turned and went out from Pharaoh to give them the opportunity of discussing the matter among themselves. And indeed, his servants urged Pharaoh to let the Israelites go and serve the Lord their God. But again, when Moses insisted that the whole people must go, the young and the old, the sons and the daughters, Pharaoh demurred, saying, I know it to be customary for young men and old men to take part in sacrifices, but surely not little children. And when you demand their presence too, you betray your evil purpose. It is but a pretense, you saying that you will go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness and then return. You mean to escape and never come back. I will have nothing more to do with the matter. My God, Baal-Zephon, will oppose you in the way and hinder you on your journey. Pharaoh's last words were a dim presentiment. As a magician, he foresaw that on their going forth from Egypt, the children of Israel would find themselves in desperate straits before the sanctuary of Baal-Zephon.
Yeah, so this does happen in the Torah. Moses, Pharaoh says to Moses, okay, who's going? And And Moses says, everybody. And he says, no, you can take your men, but you're not taking the kids. Moses says, no, we're all going, young and old, we're all going out. And Pharaoh says, no, they're bent on mischief. Your men can go, that's it. And then that's right away where the Lord says to Moses, hold out your arm over the land of Egypt and the locusts are going to come. So Pharaoh is breaking down, but he hasn't broken down yet. This last part we just read about Baal Zephon, Baal Zephon is the place where the Israelites stop at the Sea of Reeds, at the Red Sea. Now, Baal Zephon, it's interesting because Baal Zephon was, based on the name, not an Egyptian god. Whenever you see the name Baal, you know that it's a Canaanite god, right? We know that this is a god. This is not God. This is a god. Zephon is actually a place. It's the north. Mount Zephon is probably Mount Hermon, or Mount Cassius, or it's a high mountain. It's a mountain that, people would see and go, oh, that's the god. There's a god on that mountain. It's like Olympus. But the place where they stop is called Baal Zephon. We'll read that in a couple chapters. But the writers of the Midrash don't really care. All pagans are, they're all the same, and they're all gods are the same. But so they connect this to the fact that Pharaoh knows that at Baal Zephon, that God is going to, that God, this is our God, that Canaanite God, whatever, is going to stop the people there, and they're not going to be able to move from that point. Okay, well, that does happen. That's where the Red Sea is, and that's where the Israelites will end up having the top part of their redemption will happen right there. What's interesting, of course, is Baal Zephon is a storm god. He's a god of storms. And so whether or not the writers of the Midrash knew this, which I'm guessing maybe they did, they don't seem to know that Baal Zephon is not Egyptian, but Baal Zephon is a storm god, a god who would have hail come down. But it's also interesting that the storm god, the ultimate, your storm god means nothing, is what the storm god really can't do, which is what God does, which is blow apart the Red Sea so that the people can walk through. Because God's power is so big that it's not just a heavy wind. God actually makes the sea part. And the Song of Moses actually says God's nostrils blow, which almost sounds pagan, if you will, but that imagery is very much consistent with a storm god and God that, our God works on a big level, much bigger level than Baal Zephon. So the fact that Baal Zephon is mentioned, that spot, that God is mentioned at where the place where the Red Sea is been commented on by many people. But the fact that the Midrash also brings this in here now and says that Baal Zephon is going to stop you is kind of funny and meant to be even more ironic. So that is why, again, maybe the connection between the storm of hail, the hailstorm, and also what happens at the Sea of Reeds, which is, again, we just read in last week's Torah portion. Well, we'll read it again in the Midrash. Okay.
Pharaoh was not content with merely denying the request preferred by Moses and Aaron. He ordered them to be forcibly expelled from the palace. Then God sent the plague of the locusts announced by Moses before. They ate every herb of the land and all the fruit of the trees that the hail had left, and there remained not any green thing. And again Pharaoh sent for Moses and Aaron to ask their forgiveness, both for his sin against the Lord God in not having hearkened to his word, and for his sin against them in having chased them forth and intended to curse them. Moses, as before, prayed to God in Pharaoh's behalf, and his petition was granted. The plague was taken away, and in a rather surprising manner. When the swarms of locusts began to darken the land, the Egyptians caught them and preserved them in brine as a dainty to be eaten. Now the Lord turned an exceeding strong west wind, which took up the locusts and drove them into the Red Sea. Even those they were keeping in their pots flew up and away, and they had none of the expected profit.
That's kind of weird, right? That's part of the plague of locusts that you didn't expect. Was the problem with locusts is that when they eat all your crops, all you're left with is a locust. Well, if you like eating locusts, at least you get the locust. And we know, we've discussed it before. We as Jews know that locusts are about the only non-kosher animal that we have an exception for when we want to eat a locust. We're allowed to, and it's probably for this exact reason, which is if the locusts attack your crops and you have no crops left, at least you have locusts and you can live off the locusts. And that's true, and you can. It's not a fair exchange, right? It's not a good situation because they don't normally stay as well. They do if you put them in brine, right? If you pickle them, you can have them longer. But
Have a dish of pickled locust going on.
yeah, they just don't go. They don't go in as much as your grain does, right? So when you have grain, you can make it into bread, you can make it into cakes, you can make it into pies, you can do lots of cool things with your bread. Probably not as much variety with the locust. I don't know, the locust cookbook from 3,000 years ago in Egypt had a whole lot of recipes, but you can imagine not what you want to have, but at least you have that. Now, it does say in the Torah that when the plague of locusts was over, that God blew them all away, which of course is interesting because it actually says he blew them into the Sea of Reeds, which is very, 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 it's a great foreshadow of what's going to happen to the Egyptians themselves, right? That they're going to be blown into the Red Sea. So the Torah does say that they're blown into the Red Sea, but you probably, like most people, would have read that to say, oh yeah, so when they were done, when God was done with the locusts, he blew them all away. That's pretty cool. Because they didn't just like fly away, they got blown away. They came in as a miracle and they left like a miracle. That's what the Torah says. But the Midrash goes a step further, which is even the ones that they kept in jars and pots, those got blown away too, and their pot got blown away. So not their pots that they kept their stuff in, that was blown away too. So no, they got nothing. They got all their crops eaten, and they got their locusts taken away, and their Tupperware rosemary that was the locust. They had the locusts; those got blown away too. So not a good day for the Egyptians. And again, as you can see, this is a 1-2 punch with the hail and the locusts. All right. And how long did these plagues last? It tells us right here again.
The last plague but one, like those which had preceded it, endured 7 days. All the time the land was enveloped in darkness, only it was not always of the same degree of density. During the first 3 days, it was not so thick but that the Egyptians could change their posture when they desired to do so. If they were sitting down, they could rise up, and if they were standing, they could sit down. On the 4th, 5th, and 6th days, the darkness was so dense that they could not stir from their place. They either sat the whole time or stood. As they were at the beginning, so they remained until the end. The last day of darkness overtook the Egyptians, not in their own land, but at the Red Sea on their pursuit of Israel. The darkness was not of the ordinary earthly kind. It came from hell, and it could be felt. It was as thick as a dinar, and all the time it prevailed, a celestial light brightened the dwellings of the children of Israel, whereby they could see what the Egyptians were doing under cover of the darkness. This was of great advantage to them. For then when they were about to go forth from the land, and they asked their neighbors to lend them raiment and jewels of gold, jewels of silver for the journey, the Egyptians tried to deny having any in their possession. But the children of Israel, having spied out all their treasures during the days of darkness, could describe the objects they needed with accuracy and designate their hiding places. The Egyptians reasoned that the words of the Israelites could be taken implicitly as they spoke them, for if they had any idea of deceiving them, asking for a loan which they intended to keep what they laid hands on, they might have taken unobserved during the days of darkness whatever they desired. Hence, the Egyptians felt no hesitation in lending the children of Israel all the treasures they asked for.
So,
It's like they're torn between, wow, it's really clever of us to get their hands on their stuff, and wait a minute, that's stealing.
yeah. So these are all explanations for why the plague was necessary in the first place. It seems like such a strange plague, right? The ninth plague, this penultimate plague, seems in the scheme of things to be not very scary. It really doesn't. I mean, on the face of it, it's maybe the like quiet right before the storm, if you will, the the hurricane that's going to be the 10th plague. But it kind of then still begs the question, like, why bother with this plague? Like, what is the takeaway from it? So the Midrash kind of fills in some of what makes this so scary and so foreboding and so ominous and so bad. So coming from hell is pretty bad. Can't get much worse than hell darkness, right? So that's one possibility that the Midrash gives us. And of course, it's darkness that you could feel. And it's darkness that literally keeps you locked into your wherever you were at the moment. You couldn't move. So it's almost like a gel, or it's tangible. It's felt, you would feel it and you couldn't move. So this makes it really, really bad. Really kind of scary. I guess probably the best place to be when it hit would be on the toilet, because at least then you'd not have to still be on the toilet. It's horrible. I mean, it's a horrible idea of like what this was like. And then of course we get to this other issue, which is the Israelites could have left during this time, right? That the darkness would have given them a perfect opportunity to get out of town and not even worry about this. So then it begs the question, did the Israelites, could they have left? Could they have taken everything while they were in the darkness? And so, yeah, they could have. So they didn't, but they also got a good accounting of what they could ask for when they leave. So the Israelites did a little bit of reconnaissance and figured out who's got what, which is weird. But again, it begs that it's that part of that question of, couldn't they have just left and taken everything they wanted then? And the answer is yes, they could have. So they don't. They're going to get it. They're going to ask for it. And so the Midrash kind of gives us, but now they know what to ask for. They know what's there. So they seem to really, again, when they ask for it, it now seems like, oh, the Israelites are taking what they know what they're taking. So it's kind of a weird, again, connection to when they leave and what they take with them when what we take with us when we leave. So a little bit more on the darkness.
The darkness was of such a nature that it could not be dispelled by artificial means. The light of the fire kindled for household uses was either extinguished by the violence of the storm, or else it was made invisible and swallowed up in the density of the darkness. Sight, that most indispensable of all the external senses, though unimpaired, was deprived of its office, for nothing could be discerned, and all the other senses were overthrown like subjects whose leader has fallen. None was able to speak or to hear, nor could anyone venture to take food, but they lay themselves down in quiet and hunger, their outward senses in a trance. Thus they remained overwhelmed by the affliction, until Moses had compassion on them again and besought God in their behalf, who granted him the power of restoring fine weather, light instead of darkness, and day instead of night.
Yep. So if you look at what the darkness did, it also kind of allows God to it allows really God to be seen. You know, this line, sight, the most indispensable of all external senses. Is kind of like if God took away your sense of sight.
It's odd because usually we think of the other senses being keener if you lose your sight, and here it says that's not what happened.
Exactly. And that's the kind of the, I mean, there's a recognition in there exactly of what Rosemary just said, which is that this plague didn't allow for that, in that it dulled everything. And again, it's making this plague, which on the face of it doesn't seem that frightening, really frightening.
I think it would be really frightening if you were an Egyptian and worshiped the sun.
Yeah, which is interesting because they don't seem to get into that with the Midrash. I mean, it does exist, but they don't dwell on that. They don't dwell on the raw sun god.
Mm-hmm.
How about this? The rabbis really, and again, I guess because they didn't care that much about like the intricacies, or they just threw out the Baal Tzafon thing. They don't care about that. They really, first of all,
they had to make up a reason why it would be scary if that wasn't the reason.
Yeah.
But I kind of, when I was a kid, I still remember I had this science book, and it had a section at the beginning on what would happen if the sun went out, and it terrified me, and it still does. So I don't think we should just, oh, it's not that scary.
No, it is. There's that. I mean, they didn't have, of course, that view of the universe, so that wouldn't have even mattered to them. But this idea that it isn't a light, this darkness wasn't the absence of light.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing that is supposed to scare us.
It's a darkness that has it's not just the absence of something, it's a substance.
Correct. So that's what they kind of extrapolate from this. And again, it's partly because they don't really care about gods. They don't really care, quite frankly, about how the sun works.
Mm-hmm.
They're concerned with, like, okay, well, what would this be for a human being to experience? Because again, they want us to know how powerful God is, but they also want us to be, the rabbis who write this Midrash want us to be cognizant of, if God did this is my point at the beginning, that if God did this once, it can happen again. And, if the hail is being stored up for Gog and Magog, for the final battle, is there a darkness part 2 that's going to come back, and are we going to get hit with this, and what we should be afraid of? So
it does come back in the Christian Bible, doesn't
it? Darkness?
Yeah, isn't there like Jesus dies on the cross? Isn't there a darkness?
Oh, yeah.
Never
Yeah. Yep, just momentarily.
Ah.
And the curtain in the temple is rent asunder.
I remembered that part. I thought I remembered something about darkness.
Darkness, yeah. Well,
I like rent asunder.
yeah. Rending,
darkness and
rending
wind.
curtains asunder is always dramatic,
Yeah.
especially
I
if
just love it.
God. But that's by the time of the Christian Bible, and you get it in the Hebrew Bible too, those last miracles are not quite as dramatic as the ones that happen here. And there are things like that, curtains getting torn and God working on a very, very, very smaller, much smaller level. I wouldn't say less powerful, but definitely not quite at this level. This is, and again, I mean, the assumption, by the way, in that description of the curtains being rent asunder, that like could happen. If it happened, people would have definitely been freaked out by it, but it's not this. It isn't one where everybody was like,
It's very macro. It's very small. I mean, how many people are there to see the curtain rent asunder?
yeah. And that's kind of, if he said, I know it happened, he told me it happened, which is a lot different
Right.
than we were all sitting in darkness and there was nobody who had light. So this is scary. And this is, again, the fear that it's going to come back and that there's nothing like, just like there was nothing good with the locust, there's nothing the darkness did nothing. There was no bright spot, if you will, in the darkness. It was just horrible. So, let's read this part.
Intimidated by this affliction, Pharaoh permitted the people to go, the little ones as well as the men and the women. Only he asked that they let their flocks and their herds be stayed. But Moses said, as you live, our cattle also shall go with us. Yea, but, excuse me, even the hoof of an animal belongs to an Israelite. The beast shall not be left behind in Egypt. This speech exasperated Pharaoh to such a degree that he threatened Moses with death in the day he should see his face again.
Yep. And that is exactly what happens in the Torah. That says, I never want to see you again. But wait, there's more. Oh, there's one more. So again, Pharaoh, they're almost now Pharaoh's, and this is the negotiation. Pharaoh says, yeah, you guys can all go, but don't take your animals. All your kids can go, but not the animals. And Moses says, no, we're all going. Every one of us is going, and all of our animals are going too. And again, this sets up the 10th plague. So Pharaoh's breaking down, but he hasn't broken down completely. That is the final straw, which is the animals can't go. So here we go. And we get this in the Torah. We get the announcement of the 10th plague.
At this very moment, the Lord appeared to Moses and bade him inform Pharaoh of the infliction of the last plague, the slaying of the firstborn. It was the first and the last time that God revealed himself in the royal palace. He chose the residence of Pharaoh on this occasion that Moses might not be branded as a liar, for he had replied to Pharaoh's threat of killing him if he saw his face again with the words, you have spoken well, I will see your face again no more.
Yeah, so that's what the Torah says. When we're right before the 10th plague, right after the 9th plague, I should say, what happens is Pharaoh says, this is the end of literally the last verses of chapter 10. Pharaoh said to him, be gone from me. Do not take care not to let me see you again. For the moment you look upon my face, you shall die. And Moses said, you've spoken rightly. I shall not see your face again. But the next line is, the last plague.
With a loud voice, Moses proclaimed the last plague, closing his announcement with the words, And all these your servants shall come down unto me and bow themselves unto me, saying, Get you out, and all the people that follow you, and after that I will go out. Moses knew well enough that Pharaoh himself would come and urge him to lead Israel forth with as great haste as possible, but he mentioned only the servants of the king and not the king himself, because he never forgot the respect due to a ruler.
Yeah, that's kind of stupid.
Kind of odd.
That's not what you want to hear. Look, I mean, the problem is that after the 10th plague, I'm not going to ruin it for you. We're going to get to it, but first we do the Midrash. The way we're going to have this organized, it follows the way it does in the Torah, which is we have this chapter 12, which talks about what the first Passover, right? As you see it here, but it does say after the 10th plague, in the middle of the night, when the Lord struck down the firstborn, Pharaoh arose, and it says he summoned Moses and Aaron in the night and said, "Up, depart from among the people, you and the Israelites, go and worship the Lord." So the Torah says that. In the exchange we just read, Pharaoh says, I never want to see your face again. If I see your face, you're going to die. And Moses says, yeah, good. And that's what's going to happen. And yet the Torah tells us that he did call him back. So I guess what you just saw in the Midrash is why. Well, first you could just basically say, well, Pharaoh is wrong. Pharaoh, Moses pays him the courtesy and the respect due to a Pharaoh, but yet that's not what happens. And so Pharaoh had the right to change his mind, I guess you could say. But there's another possibility that when Pharaoh called him back the last time, it's the middle of the night. He doesn't see him. He knows he's there, but Moses stands there in the darkness and doesn't let Pharaoh see him again. So there's this weird thing of, does Moses not grant Pharaoh? He grants Pharaoh an audience because he's the Pharaoh, but he doesn't let Pharaoh see him because Pharaoh himself said, I'm not going to see you again. So there's that question of, again, how this all goes down. I mean, the bottom line is Pharaoh could have changed his mind and said, hey, bring Moses and Aaron to me. This is it. I'm getting rid of them now. So now we read what this meant in the Midrash. And this is in the middle of, well, not the middle, but at the end of the plagues. Chapter 12 is all about, and it's a fairly long chapter. It begins, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall mark for you the beginning of the months. It shall be the first of months of the year for you. Speak to the community, and goes on to talk about the lamb and how you eat it and sacrifice it and not to eat leavened. And it goes on for 27 verses, and it ends with, and when your children ask, what do you mean by this rite? You shall say, it is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord. He passed over the house of the Israelites and smote the Egyptians, but saved our houses. That's the first Passover. And it is what we reenact every year, starting in about 2 months. 2 months from last week, we do our Passover. So it's a pretty long discussion in the midst of, right before we get to the climax of the 10th plague. So clearly they're linked together. They have to be there. But there also is this idea that, wow, this is a pretty important thing, because get back to the plague. I mean, we all want to go back to the action, but yet now we have this really important holiday that we're going to tell you about to remember this amazing time. So here is the first Passover, Midrash on Passover, if you will, to some extent. Here we go.
When the time approached in which, according to the promise made to Abraham, his children would be redeemed, It was seen that they had no pious deeds to their credit, for the sake of which they deserved release from bondage. God therefore gave them 2 commandments, one bidding them to sacrifice the Paschal lamb, and one to circumcise their sons. Along with the first, they received the calendar in use among the Jews, for the Passover feast is to be celebrated on the 15th day of the month of Nisan, and with this month the year is to begin. But the computations for the calendar are so involved that Moses could not understand them until God showed him the movements of the moon plainly. There were 3 other things equally difficult, which Moses could comprehend only after God made him to see them plainly. They were the compounding of the holy anointing oil, the construction of the candlestick in the tabernacle, and the animals, the flesh of which is permitted or prohibited. Also, the determination of the new moon was a subject of special divine teaching. That Moses might know the exact procedure, God appeared to him in a garment with fringes upon its corners, bade Moses stand at his right hand and Aaron at his left, and then, citing Michael and Gabriel as witnesses, he addressed searching questions to the angels as to how the new moon had seemed to them. Then the Lord addressed Moses and Aaron, saying, "Thus shall my children proclaim the new moon on the testimony of 2 witnesses and through the president of the court."
So this again doesn't seem to be necessarily as well connected to what we're reading right now, because we dove into things that Moses didn't understand yet, which is interesting because even though God is talking to Moses on a fairly regular basis, Moses definitely doesn't get it all yet. There's things that Moses won't understand until God lays it out to him later on in the Torah, later on in the book of Exodus, in the book of Leviticus, that Moses is still learning. So this is an interesting kind of, if you will, understanding that Moses didn't get it all at once. Moses is still there's things that Moses doesn't understand about God's ways and what God wants us to do. So, including, by the way, even figuring out time. But again, Moses doesn't understand all the law yet. That's an interesting, really to contemplate that by itself, to just understand that, yeah, Moses didn't get it all. But I want to just direct you again to the very beginning, which is this weird thing that we read, that Abraham, we remember, is told your descendants are going to be redeemed from Egypt. And so the rabbis asked the question, well, why do they deserve to be redeemed? Well, why did we deserve to be redeemed? Like, did we do anything good? Was there anything good about us? And they basically say, well, they didn't have 613 commandments because Moses didn't have the commandments yet. Moses couldn't even understand the commandments. But we had 2 commandments. We had 2 commandments, and we get 2 commandments before we get the rest of the law. The other 611 commandments we're going to get from Mount Sinai on. Means that for the first book of the Bible, all 50 chapters of Genesis, and the first 12 chapters of Exodus, which means for, let's say roughly 25% of the Bible, of the Torah, not the Bible, 25% of the Torah, we have no mitzvot, no commandments. We got 2 commandments. Sacrifice your babies when they're 8 days old, those boys, and sacrifice a lamb. Yes, sacrifice a lamb. Those are the things that you do. And based on those 2 commandments, we get redeemed. We only had to do 2 things. Because the rabbis acknowledged that the Jews that up until that time didn't have to do anything. They weren't accountable for anything.
That's probably why Miriam was allowed to sing and dance in front of the whole people.
Yeah, because I haven't heard that one before, but you could.
I was wondering how they reconciled that.
Well, here's how they reconcile it. I think you could probably figure out how they could reconcile it. They have the very observant folks that would talk about that would have an issue with Kol Isha, with the sound of the singing of women, if you will.
Mhm.
It's real important to remember this. They don't have an issue with women singing. They have an issue with me and any other man hearing those women sing. Well, you can hear your wife sing, but I can't hear someone else's wife sing. And that's the issue. So hearing a woman sing is only a problem if you're a man who's not married to said woman. So women are allowed to sing in groups of other women. So you can have women prayer groups, which they do in some Orthodox communities. You can have women singing just as long as nobody else hears them sing. I mean, the women are allowed to sing the brachot. Well, which brachot? I mean, specifically the candle blessing. They're allowed to sing the blessing in their own home, but only around their own family and around other women. So if Miriam leads the women in song, they can have a separate singing group with the other women, right? So it only says Miriam led the women in song. It doesn't mean that the men heard her singing in front of them. So that's the way they rationalize it. One way to rationalize it. You just gave us a whole nother one, Rosemary, which is they didn't know any better. And so they were not accountable for that. The rabbis usually don't like to do that, by the way. They don't like to say that the people didn't know the law or weren't breaking the law. There's a difference between breaking the law, or at least, let's say, notable people breaking the law. They wouldn't like Miriam breaking the law. An average Israelite, they might not have an issue with. But as we've talked about before, they don't like the idea that Abraham isn't keeping kosher. When he feeds the angels and he gives them milk and meat together, they don't like that. They come up with interesting explanations that he didn't actually give them milk. He gave them fat. He gave them meat fat, and he didn't give them milk or dairy, I should say, cheese or curds, that he actually gave them
Not cheese.
schmaltz. If he gave them schmaltz, they
Almond
can have
milk.
schmaltz, and that's not a problem.
Oat milk.
But they don't like the idea that Abraham didn't keep kosher. So that's not, they're not cool with Miriam. They wouldn't be cool with Miriam just didn't know any better. They like at least that our leaders somehow knew the law or had some intrinsic understanding of this, or it somehow got passed down by certain people, which is why they're careful. The rabbis are careful here, which isn't that Moses didn't know anything. So maybe Moses knew some things, but he didn't understand it completely. So when it says that he didn't know the animals of the flesh, which is permitted and prohibited, you get some weird ideas that Moses had a very limited diet up until that time because he didn't want to break the law, or he just ate, sheep and cows and things that were obviously going to still be kosher, so that Moses didn't unintentionally break the law. But there is that fear that, well, if the people didn't have the law, then how did they not know any better? Well, maybe the average person didn't know any better, but not the leaders. They don't like that idea. But the bottom line is that they just told us is the people are not responsible for anything other than 2 commandments up until Mount Sinai. They only have to circumcise their boys at 8 days, and they have to eat Passover sacrifice. By the way, that kind of implies that these are really, really important laws that predate even the 10 commandments. So Passover is like really important if it comes even before the 10 commandments. Something to that. Oh, but that's a law that comes before the 10 commandments. It does. It does. Factually, it does. There's only 2 commandments. So if you go through a book that has the 613 commandments, very careful to say there's only 2 up until Exodus chapter 19. There's only 2. That's it. It's a question whether people would say be fruitful and multiply is a commandment, but it clearly is not included as one of the commandments that's incumbent on people, or at least on Jews. You could make the argument that being fruitful and multiply is a commandment to everybody. But you could also make the argument it's not a commandment at all. It's a divine imperative. It's a instinct that it's maybe ideal, but it's not required, which also, again, would give us the understanding that God would not require something of us that some people can't do. So if you can't physically have children, why would God command us to have children if we can't physically have children? So that's a whole nother discussion about commandments. But there's only 2 before Mount Sinai. All right. More about this great month we have coming up.
When Moses appeared before the children of Israel and delivered the divine message to them, telling them their redemption would come about in this month of Nisan, they said, "How is it possible that we should be redeemed? Is not the whole of Egypt full of our idols? And we have no pious deeds to show, making us worthy of redemption." Moses replied and said, "As God desires your redemption, he pays no heed to your idols. He passes them by. Nor does he look upon your evil deeds, but only upon the good deeds of the pious among you."
Wow. So the Israelites admit that they've been worshiping other gods. It says we've been doing this whole time. And Moses says, God forgives you. God doesn't hold you responsible. That is an admission that the Israelites were worshiping other gods. On the other hand, Passover is going to kind of clean the slate. And it also is interesting because the rabbis say, yeah, but they were also fulfilling that other commandment of circumcising, which, again, we don't know for sure that they were, but maybe they were in Egypt. And if they were, then at least they were keeping that commandment. They hadn't abandoned that commandment. And there is a teaching that they had abandoned every commandment. The Israelites were literally on the last rung before you can't even be redeemed anymore. They'd done everything that you're not supposed to do, but they still did that. There's also a teaching that they still were giving Hebrew names to people, which is an interesting one too. But the idol worship is an issue. Here we go.
God,
Yeah, sorry.
Was
So,
was there a midrash, or did I dream it, that when they get out of Egypt, they circumcise everybody? It wasn't.
no, that's in the Torah, right?
It
But
is
it's
in the
not when they
Torah.
leave Egypt. It's when they come into the land of Israel, right? So Joshua has that whole generation circumcised at that moment as they're crossing by Mount Ebal. They create literally what's called the mountain of circumcision, of foreskin.
Right.
And that does happen. But there's a question of whether that's the generation that left Egypt. Did the Jews that died in the wilderness, were they circumcised?
Okay.
And then these guys that are about to cross into the land only get circumcised when they're about to cross in. So they've been saving up for that moment of the final act of we're starting over with a clean slate, which again, circumcision, Passover, all that stuff is connected. The blood of the doorposts is, if you will, a blood sacrifice. Circumcision, to some extent, is a blood sacrifice, a blood offering. I'm not arguing that that's the only reason why we do it or whatever, but there is blood that comes out at that moment, which is connected to God in some ways. And again, all of it is connected to the horrible ideas of ritual sacrifice and blood libels, which later on becomes part of history because it's drawn together with Passover. So they're all connected. They're all connected. And of course, it even gets more conflated when you have Jesus also basically saying that his blood and his body are the Passover sacrifice. I mean, that's underlying the blood libel is the fact that Christians who would say, oh yeah, but you know that Passover sacrifice is Jesus. There was a body that was offered up. It is offered up every day that we do a Eucharist. So all of this is all here. it's all part of the Passover sacrifice. It's really like it's in the whole thing. I mean, the blood that's put on the doorposts is a remembrance of almost dying. And if you recall, it's also this idea that your children, your firstborn children, will be redeemed with a pinyon haben because of this too. So I mean, we literally had a ritual. Chapter 13 of Exodus continues this idea when it says, consecrate me every firstborn, man and beast. The first issue of every womb of the Israelites is mine. This remembrance of this moment, like every time a Jewish male baby was born first, the mother had to redeem it from the priests because it is God's as well. So there is a definite, I don't want to say human sacrifice element here, but it's all wrapped up into it. I mean, it's all there. The layers are all there because this last plague is death, and it's death. It's not death of children. We always want to remind people that it's actually more than that. It's the death of all the firstborn, but it's the death of people. This is death. The plague of death is like, there's nothing worse than that. Everything else is kind of like a reminder of, don't get to this point. Don't get to the death of the firstborn. But let's continue on, because we will get to this issue of Rosemary brought up of the idolatry unique to the Egyptians.
God would not indeed have delivered Israel if they had not abandoned their idol worship. To this purpose, he commanded them to sacrifice the Paschal lamb. Thus, they were to show that they had given up the idolatry of the Egyptians, consisting in the worship of the ram. The early law was different from the practice of later times, for they were bidden to select their sacrificial animal 4 days before the day appointed for the offering, and to designate it publicly as such, to show that they did not stand in awe of the Egyptians.
Yeah, well, that's what it says in the Torah, that the picking out of the animal was part of the ritual. I mean, the Torah actually says that. The Torah says that you're going to pick out the animal 4 days before. Well, let's read the next paragraph and we'll get to it. We'll explain this little thing here.
With a heavy heart, the Egyptians watched the preparations of the Israelites for sacrificing the animals they worshipped. Yet they did not dare interpose an objection. And when the time came for the offering to be made, the children of Israel could perform the ceremonies without a tremor, seeing that they knew through many days' experience that the Egyptians feared to approach them with hostile intent. There was another practice connected with the slaughter of the Paschal lamb that was to show the Egyptians how little the Israelites feared them. They took of the blood of the animal and openly put it on the 2 side posts and on the lintel of the doors of their houses.
Yep. Again, to show people, show a little picture of their god, Amun-Ra. Let's show the Amun-Ra. What the Egyptians like to worship. These are that's the temple in Karnak, Luxor. Rows and rows of Amun-Ra depicted as a ram. There's Amun-Ra. So that's their head god, Amun-Ra. So this was their head god, the god of their sun god, their life god. And yeah, this is the plague that not only affects the people, but affects their God, because the Israelites are slaughtering their head god on their way out, which is again the equivalent of going to India and killing a bunch of cows before you get on out of there. And by the way, people die in India when that happens. I mean, today, like a week ago, when Muslim and Hindu relations go south, sometimes it's literally over some people openly mistreating and killing a cow to upset, Hindu leaders. And, that, look, I mean, who starts it, but sometimes that's all it takes. So the Israelites had a good understanding of this. In the ancient world, people had a good understanding of what upsets people as far as taboo and what is considered to be really, really disrespectful. Interestingly, by the way, this argument that the Jewish people considered pigs to be taboo doesn't really fly, because pigs don't fly. No, because pigs, we don't have an issue with you killing a pig. Like if you killed a pig in front of a Jew, no one's going to go, "Oh, you killed a pig." There's no issue with, like, Jews don't instinctively they never seem to have instinctively had an issue with someone killing a pig. That's not the case with animals that are taboo, which are the animals that are you worship or are representations of that god. That's not the case here. The Egyptians are incensed by this, and they have to keep their mouths shut. So that's part of what is the power of this last plague, is that the buildup for it, the killing of the rams themselves, of these lambs, was done in a very dramatic way. And that's what the Torah says, that they had 4 days earlier, they go around picking out their lamb that they're going to slaughter. So it's really dramatic, and it's a real stick it to the Egyptians. And it's why, again, Passover, this first Passover is so dramatic, this Passover offering, because the Egyptians have to watch it happen in their own backyard, no question. First Passover happened in Egypt, happened in Africa. The most important Jewish holiday in the Bible doesn't happen in Israel for the first time, happens in Egypt. All right, let's see what happens here.
Moses communicated the laws regulating the Passover sacrifice to the elders, and they in turn made them known to the people at large. The elders were commended for having supported the leader at his first appearance, for their faith in Moses caused the whole people to adhere to him at once. Therefore God spoke, saying, "I will reward the elders for inspiring the people with confidence in Moses. They shall have the honor of delivering Israel. They shall lead the people to the Passover sacrifice, and through this, the redemption will be brought about."
And it does say the elders participated in this. So the elders did a good job here. They don't always do a good job, the elders. So the fact that they did a good job here kind of sets the stage for why they even got to do things in the future, because they did do a good job here. All right.
The ceremonies connected with the Passover sacrifice had the purpose of conveying instruction to Israel about the past and the future alike. The blood put on the 2 side posts and on the lintel of their doors was to remind them of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the bunch of hyssop for sprinkling the blood on the doors was to imply that although Israel's position among the peoples of the earth is as lowly as that of the hyssop among the plants, yet this little nation is bound together like the bunch of hyssop, for it is God's peculiar treasure.
Yeah, interesting. So what happens here in the Torah is let's show everybody a little hyssop too, that we here's a little hyssop for you. Hold it. There's some hyssop. It's a you see, it's a semi-evergreen perennial. It
like
looks
lavender.
nice. Yeah, it looks nice. Looks exactly a little bit like lavender. It's it has a minty flavor, so you can eat it, or you can put it in your recipes, maybe a Passover recipe. But it's not a fancy thing. It's it's a bush, it's a shrub. And yet the Jewish people are a shrub. There's nothing special about it. There's nothing special about us. But it shows you that God doesn't care. God doesn't look for big, powerful nations, doesn't look for, God comes out in a bush, and God uses a bush for doing miracles. So remember that. They have this interesting point that the blood is actually on three places, right? It's on the two doorposts and on the lintel above. So that's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The three, I guess you could also say the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But no, our Trinity is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so the three teaches us a reminder of where we started from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and again, where we're going, which is we're a bush. There's nothing special about us, but we're yet still God's treasure. So it's kind of a nice thing there, if you will. Back to the circumcision. If you thought we were done, now there's a midrash here about this. Yeah.
The Paschal sacrifice afforded Moses the opportunity for inducing the children of Israel to submit themselves to circumcision, which many had refused to do until then, in spite of his urgent appeals. But God has means of persuasion. He caused a wind to blow that wafted the sweet scents of paradise toward Moses' Paschal lamb, and the fragrance penetrated to all parts of Egypt to the distance of a 40 days' journey. The people were attracted in crowds to Moses' lamb, and they desired to partake of it. But he said, "This is the command of God. No uncircumcised person shall eat thereof." And they all decided to undergo circumcision. When the Lord passed through the land of Egypt, he blessed every Israelite for his fulfillment of the two commands, the command of the Paschal sacrifice and the command regarding circumcision. Can we use this on the anti-vaxxers?
Well, interesting. Yeah, look, the Passover sacrifice is supposed to be eaten. It's a pretty big, as we talked about, it's a pretty big law, right? That this is supposed to be done by the community. Well, it says specifically that people who eat of it should be circumcised. This is not for anybody to eat, but this idea of people who are.
So did the women get to eat it?
Well, not only it does say the women get to eat it, but it also says that the people who are in your house get to eat it. But it seems as though at least the people who offered it and the people who are running the house are circumcised when they eat it, because it is a sacrifice. Now, normally we think of sacrifices as sacrifices that are done in the temple, or before that at the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and they're done by priests. But this is a sacrifice that's done by everybody. Everybody does this sacrifice. So the Passover sacrifice is done by the head of the household. In a sense, at that moment, the head of the household, whether he's a Kohen or not, a Levi or not, doesn't matter. He's the priest of the household and does the sacrifice. Slaughters the animal, puts the blood on the doors, on the doorpost, and then they eat it. And then they got to eat all of it. And if they don't eat all of it, they got to burn up everything that they didn't eat. It's a pretty specific ritual. But it's weird because, again, it's not done by the priests. And the Torah is very explicit that everybody does it. So look, they allowed people to do it. Passover sacrifice was a sacrifice. Later on, it becomes less of a sacrifice and more of a meal. But it does imply that there are sacrifices that are done not by the priests. But there's another problem here, which we're going to see in the last part of this. Why don't you read the last paragraph and then we'll finish up about this.
The Lord performed a great miracle for the Israelites. As no sacrifice may be eaten beyond the borders of the Holy Land, all the children of Israel were transported thither on clouds. And after they had eaten of the sacrifice, they were carried back to Egypt in the same way.
So
So all of this, God could have just moved the children of Israel to
yeah, we already
land. He
we
didn't have
already
to
got
wander
we were
around.
there, but we weren't really there. We were there on clouds above it. We didn't really take place there. Look, all of this is here because, well, wait a second. Are the people circumcised or not? Because if they're not circumcised already, they couldn't have eaten of the sacrifice. So they all got to get circumcised in order to have the sacrifice, to eat the Passover. So that's why the people would have been that's why the people who were alive at the first Passover would have been circumcised, according to that logic. The other possibility is no, they just weren't circumcised yet. It's all speculation because, again, from what we know, the Egyptians were circumcised. So being circumcised wouldn't have been so weird. If they're following Egyptian practice at the time, one can make the argument, you could make the argument that they were circumcised. They were circumcised because they were following Egyptian practice and got circumcised. I mean, there's the theory, of course, of Freud is that that's where we picked up. It wasn't his theory. Other people were saying it at the time, but he popularized it, that we got circumcision. We as Jews got circumcision from the Egyptians.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a real possibility, again, that, the people weren't circumcised. They had the first Passover there. And where else were they going to have the first Passover sacrifice? They're in Egypt. It says they're in Egypt. But there's a problem that the rabbis have, which is, but you're not supposed to have sacrifices outside the land of Israel. Well, does that mean you're not supposed to have a Passover meal outside? Well, yeah, maybe, but you don't have a sacrifice. You don't eat it as a sacrifice. You could have lamb, but you don't have it as a sacrifice. You don't put blood on the doorposts as a sacrifice, but you can still have a Passover meal. So all of those things are kind of at play here. But again, it gets back to this first Passover meal in Egypt seems to be pretty powerful and kind of like really connected to the last plague, which is why we have chapter 11 and before we get into the plague of the firstborn. I mean, it's all connected. The blood on the doorpost is going to stop the plague. And whenever we eat the Passover sacrifice, we're taken back to that moment where the plague passed over our homes. And God does big miracles tonight. God's out smiting our enemies on that night. That's why we sing that. Well, we don't, but why our ancestors said, Shvo Chamacha. God, go out there and kill those people who would kill us right now. Do that miracle. The miracle you did on that night in Passover, do it again. Do it again. Do it here in Egypt. Do it in Spain. Do it in
Las Vegas.
Do it in Poland. Do that miracle outside of our house like you did thousands of years ago. Why don't you run that outside the Warsaw Ghetto right now as we're having our Passover 1943? Come on, God, do that again. And that's the smiting. So we're going to finish up with this today. 10th plague.
When Moses announced the slaying of the firstborn, the designated victims all repaired to their fathers and said, "Whatever Moses has foretold has been fulfilled. Let the Hebrews go, else we shall all die." But the fathers replied, "It is better for one of every 10 of us to die than that the Hebrews should execute their purpose." Then the firstborn repaired to Pharaoh to induce him to dismiss the children of Israel. So far from granting their wish, he ordered his servants to fall upon the firstborn and beat them, to punish them for their presumptuous demand. Seeing that they could not accomplish their end by gentle means, they attempted to bring it about by force. Pharaoh and all the...
Hold it a second. So everybody sees what happens there.
Mm-hmm.
Pharaoh still doesn't want to do it because,
By hardening Pharaoh's heart, isn't God sort of grandstanding?
Oh yeah, that is the ultimate grandstanding, right? This is God ultimately saying, I'm not going to be done. I'm not going to be done until the Egyptians, until this 10th plague. And they have to completely give up. Yep. All right.
Pharaoh and all that opposed the wishes of the firstborn were of the opinion that the loss of so inconsiderable a percentage of the population was a matter of small moment. They were mistaken in their calculation, for the divine decree included not only the firstborn sons, but also the firstborn daughters, and not only the firstborn of the marriages then existing, but also the firstborn issuing from previous alliances of the fathers and the mothers. And as the Egyptians led dissolute lives, it happened not rarely that each of the 10 children of one woman was the firstborn of its father. Finally, God decreed that death should smite the oldest member of every household, whether or not he was the firstborn of his parents. What God resolves is executed. At the exact instant marking the middle of the night, so precise that only God himself could determine and discern it, he appeared in Egypt, attended by 9,000 myriads of the angels of destruction, who are fashioned some of hail and some of flames, and whose glances drive terror and trembling to the heart of the beholder. These angels were about to precipitate themselves into the work of annihilation, but God restrained them, saying, "My wrath will not be appeased until I myself execute vengeance upon the enemies of Israel."
Yeah. So this gets to the bigger issue, which is it the angels that do this, or is it God that does it? The angels, according to this, are locked and loaded and ready to go. And God says, you know what? I'm doing this myself. Which is, again, this kind of idea that it was not angels that did this. It was God, that God does the smiting. Again, who's getting smote? Not just men, but women as well, the firstborn daughters. This wasn't just against men. This was against daughters, which is why we have a tradition of fasting. The fast of the firstborn is incumbent not just on men, but on women as well. When we fast the day before Passover, my eldest daughter, Rachel, does fast with me on that day, as a reminder that could have been us. So again, according to this, it was women. And what, of course, the rabbis did so beautifully here is not take a couple knocks at the Egyptians too, in their dissolute lives of having multiple partners, that it wasn't just the official marriages that the firstborn died of. It was actually the behavior that some women had more than one lover, and they had other children that would have died in the house. Just a kind of a way to further discredit and make the Egyptians not good people. That was the way the plague worked, though, according to this. According to this, actually, and other people died too. So what was interesting about that all was that the Pharaoh kind of says, so what? Cost of doing business, right? I'm not going to help the Israelites. If they have this plague, fine, go ahead. We'll lose some people. We'll lose only the firstborn. He's doing the calculations in his head. If every Egyptian woman has 3 or 4 kids, what difference does losing one kid make? We're not letting the people go. So that's what he did. He did the Torah just says he did a calculation. He did it. He did that horrible calculation in his head. So if we lose some people, so what? The price of going to war. And he's wrong, but he did that. He made that calculation. All right.
Those among the Egyptians who gave credence to Moses' words and tried to shield their firstborn children from death sent them to their Hebrew neighbors to spend the fateful night with them, in the hope that God would exempt the houses of the children of Israel from the plague. But in the morning, when the Israelites arose from their sleep, they found the corpses of the Egyptian fugitives next to them. That was the night in which the Israelites prayed before lying down to sleep. Cause us, O Lord our God, to lie down in peace. Remove Satan from before us and from behind us, and guard our going out and our coming into life and into peace. for it was Satan that had caused frightful bloodshed among the Egyptians.
Yeah, that answers the question, I guess. What about Egyptians who said, you know what? I see the Israelites are painting blood on their door. They're going to be spared. Let's leave our kids off there tonight. I'll have a sleepover. Didn't work, according to this. God knows. According to this Midrash too, it's Satan that went around and did this stuff, which leads this Midrash writer to throw in a little something for us. This is how we got our Hashkivenu prayer. Now, we don't usually pray this during the Hashkivenu in our day, but if you look at the traditional Hashkivenu prayer, it says, remove Satan from before us and from behind us. Guard our coming and going out in life and peace. L'shalom, right? Hamidenu l'chaim l'shalom. That part we have. The part that we kind of took out from the modern day Hashkivenu prayer is take away Satan. That is in the Hashkivenu prayer traditionally. So according to this is the first time that we said the Hashkivenu prayer because it was Satan that was out there doing it. So this is one where it's not God, it's the angel of death in the form of Satan who's out there doing it. All right.
Among the slain there were, besides the Egyptian firstborn, also the firstborn of other nationalities residing in Egypt, as well as the Egyptian firstborn dwelling outside of their own land. Even the long dead of the firstborn were not spared. The dogs dragged their corpses out of their graves in the houses, for it was the Egyptian custom to inter the dead at home. At the appalling sight, the Egyptians mourned as though the bereavement had befallen them but recently. The very monuments and statues erected to the memory of the firstborn dead were changed into dust, which was scattered and flew out of sight. Moreover, their slaves had to share the fate of the Egyptians, and no less the firstborn of the captive that was in the dungeon. For none was so low, but he hated the Hebrews and rejoiced when the Egyptians decreed their persecution. The female slaves that ground corn between millstones were in the habit of saying, we do not regret our servitude if only the Israelites are gagged too.
So let's explain that Midrash, which of course has got so much there. And we're going to read one more paragraph today, but this paragraph is so juicy, so much there. By the way, some of this is used in the movies about the plague. Actually, in the movie The Prince of Egypt, the movie version, cartoon version or animated version, I should say, there are statues that actually melt. Of course, follow this Midrash that statues to firstborn rulers and pharaohs and priests, those would melt away. And of course, as you read, the dogs would drag out the bodies of those firstborn and they were disrespected. It didn't even matter if you were dead. By the way, this is the connection to the dogs that will not even make a noise on this night. And so the dogs are brought into this, and they're brought in even further in the Midrash in that they're going to be kind of God's instrument of ickiness here, which is that it didn't matter whether you were alive or dead. It was not a good day to be a firstborn in Egypt. And again, it didn't matter even if you weren't in Egypt at the time. If you were a firstborn Egyptian living in somewhere in Africa or somewhere else in Asia, you were dead too. So it's crazy. I mean, it's like a horrible. I mean, this is like taking it to the extreme. Like, how far can we go? But you know what's interesting in this Midrash, which again seems so fanciful and so bizarre and so magical and weird, there's a really amazing truth that is unearthed here, which is that the Torah says that even the slaves, the firstborn of the slaves, died in the dungeons. And you'd wonder, like, why does the Torah say that? Like, that seems so harsh that it says from the firstborn of Pharaoh even down to the firstborn in the dungeon. And it's this weird thing. You'd be like, wouldn't God have mercy on the people who are already bad off, right? You know, their lives are already messed up. Maybe those people didn't have to suffer, but yet it says that they did. And it's this really interesting idea that the Midrash is kind of leaving us with, which is maybe the people who were bad off hated the Hebrews just as much as the wealthy middle class strata of Egyptian society, which is that sometimes persecuted minority groups don't necessarily find common cause with each other. And that maybe some of these slaves, if you will, said, I don't care about me being a slave, just as long as they're slaves too. And that is a true, really powerful truth. And it's one that is unfortunately still part of human society, where people somehow find comfort, somehow find, joy in the suffering of other people. As long as I don't care that I'm suffering, as long as he's suffering too. It's really, really sad. It goes for groups of people, ethnic groups, minority groups, but it also goes for individuals. Like, I don't care if I'm suffering, as long as that person who I really don't like is suffering too. But that's a really powerful truth here, which is, again, drawn out from this idea that even the lowly slaves suffered this fate. But the Midrash is telling us that just because they were slaves doesn't mean that they necessarily had any compassion or empathy for the Israelites. On the contrary, maybe they took joy out of it. It's really sad, but it's true. I mean, it's an unfortunate truth of suffering. So let's read this last paragraph on the 10th plague.
In dealing out punishment to these aliens in the land of Egypt, God showed that he was at once the master of the land and the Lord over all the gods of the nations. For if the slaves and the captives of war had not been smitten, they would have said, Mighty is our God who helped us in this plague. For the same reason, all the idols of the Egyptians were swept out of existence in that night. The stone idols were ground into dust. The wooden idols rotted, and those made of metal melted away. And so the Egyptians were kept from ascribing their chastisement to the wrath of their own gods. Likewise, the Lord God slew the firstborn of the cattle, for the Egyptians paid worship to animals, and they would have attributed their misfortunes to them. In all these ways, the Lord showed them that their gods were but vanity.
Yep. And so this is this idea that the plagues were also a plague on the Egyptian theological system, that they were going to have their theologies just destroyed as well. So the animals had to, why did the animals die? Why would animals have died? Because they worshiped them. And this is again part of the reason why innocent animals, if you will, had to suffer. It was because the Egyptians needed to learn that their animals were also just animals. They weren't gods. So the idols, the statues, they all melted away and rotted in the plague as well. So it wasn't just a plague on people, it was a plague on their system of belief. And essentially they're taking away, God was taking away their future and their past. And it's, again, obviously a reminder for people that were still worshiping idols during the time that the Midrash was written, that those idols are useless. They're useless compared to God. So when we come back next week, God willing, in good health, that we should all be spared plague and destruction, that we will have a chance to read about redemption. The story of Exodus, as the article points out, the first part of it is all about redemption. It's all about what we learn, what we take away from knowing that we were redeemed, that we were slaves. Because again, as much as slaves suffered during this, we're supposed to remember that we were slaves, and that every human being has a dignity to them and deserves to be redeemed. It's not wealthy people that get redeemed. It's slaves that get redeemed. And if if it can happen to us, it can happen to anybody. And you can make the argument it should happen to everybody. So that is the stuff that we read about is redemption, which of course is not free of drama. And we're going to read the Midrash on what it was like to leave and to cross, to leave Egypt, and also to cross the Sea of Reeds, because that's what we're going to be reading about next week. Next week, we read about the Exodus itself, crossing the sea. And as you can see, the text ends, the next volume of Ginsburg begins with, we're actually going to finish that section, and maybe we may not get to the beginning of this part, which is the wilderness, but that is what we're going to be reading in the coming weeks, is crossing the Red Sea, which is not until, takes a couple weeks. We're going to be reading this section here, which is when the sea actually parts. So that's what we got coming up, everybody. I hope you all maintain. Yeah, please.
Well, it's a little bit ahead of where we are, but first in my text, Moses sings the Song of the Sea first, and then Miriam.
Yeah. One can make the argument, which again is in Friedman's book. It's very clear, though, Miriam is singing that song. The issue is the song, which is chapter 15. It says that she sang the song, and
Right.
It doesn't give us the whole song again, but it says she sang the song.
But it starts, chapter 15 in my Revised Standard begins with Moses singing the song.
Yep.
Moses and the people.
Yep. And so, look, the argument that Friedman has is that you have two versions of the story. You have a version that Miriam sings it, and you have a version that Moses sings it. The issue is that there is something in there in the mind of, there's something here, which is, most people recognize, anybody, regardless of whether you believe the Bible was written by one person or not, most people recognize that the Song of the Sea is a unique style. It's a song, it's a poem, right? So everybody knows that is different. It's all different. The language is different. The rhythm is different. It's written a different way in the Torah, right? If you look at the Torah, it's written, that's beautiful, written in waves, right? It's even written differently. It's not even written in the normal justified print script in the Torah. So everybody knows it's different. The way that the Bible, right, the way that is set up, that God, when it says that Moses sang this song, that's the last line of the narrative. And then it begins with the song. So the problem is that a writer very easily could have begun, introduced the song with the Israelites sang this song to the Lord, they said. And that, so it says, Az Yashir Moshe V'nei Yisrael et Ashira Hazot. And then it begins. The thing that's suspect about that is that it seems as though when the Torah says it later on in verse 20, Miriam the prophet is Aaron's sister, which, by the way, why doesn't it say Moses' sister? So a discussion for another time. Took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out with their timbrels, and Miriam chanted for them, sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. That is the text itself. Now, the way that it's read in verse 20 and 21, it seems as though that's a recounting of something that actually happened, that people are actually saying in the narrative, this is what happened. The way it is at the beginning of chapter 15 is an introduction to the song, which again it's not that it didn't happen. We don't know that the way it exactly happened, but the way it says it in the narrative, it's actually built into the narrative. The way that it is at the beginning of chapter 15, it introduces, the narrative introduces the line that comes after it. And the argument would be that an author, a redactor, put that line in, and that the original way that it went was that Miriam sang that song, and everybody knew that Miriam sang that song.
Rabbi Alicia McGall in Sedona makes sure that we all know that Miriam sang the song.
Look, we can't ignore that the Torah doesn't say that, right? So that's where I would draw my line, is saying, yeah, but the Torah doesn't say that. The Torah says both. So that's why people today, when we sing Mi Chamocha, we sing, and Miriam and Moses and Miriam sang the song. That's why it's been introduced into the liturgy that we say Moses and Miriam. It is fair to say that we should say Miriam as well, but to say that Moses didn't sing the song we can't say that.
Well, she just ignores that. That's
I know.
all.
On the
It's not
other
that she
hand,
doesn't say it.
I know. On the other hand, it is difficult to say that only Miriam sang it. I believe, I'm going to be very clear, I believe that Miriam did sing the song first. That is my belief in the way that
Absolutely.
in the way that it says it. And it just makes sense the way the Torah presents it. Not my feminist leanings, which they exist. I get that. I want Miriam to sing the song, but the Torah does seem to say that. On the other hand, the Torah explicitly also says that Moses led the people in the song. So I can't ignore that the Torah says that.
Maybe he was just conducting the orchestra.
Well, that's definitely not the case. But I do think that the Torah preserves that idea that Miriam sang the song first, or that there was a tradition that it was a song of Miriam. And I would say again, the fact that the Haftarah is the song of Deborah for last week is really a good indication that the rabbis knew that these were women's songs. But
Right.
Moses does get mentioned first. So you can't say Moses isn't mentioned. You could say that, yes, it was an early appropriation of the woman's song. But look, I don't know what to tell you other than that's what the text has. If you want to read more about it, read this because
I like an earlier appropriation of Miriam's song. I like that. I can go with that.
It is what it is. And so I look, there's a bigger issue, which we won't get into now. Maybe we'll talk about it when we read the Midrash on it. The song itself is a really, really anthropomorphic and difficult song. I think one could make the argument that it would be a better thing for men to say that this was a man's song, because the words actually say Adonai ish milchama, Adonai shemo, which literally means the Lord is a man of war. The translations, your
very
translation
militaristic.
might not say God is a man of war. The one that I have, which is a more orthodox translation, says the Lord, the warrior, Lord is his name, Adonai shemo, Yud He Vav He is his name. What does your translation say for verse 3?
Verse 3, it says, the Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name.
It's a pretty literal translation. It's a pretty accurate translation. Pretty accurate words of Ish Milchama. And when
Isn't
it says,
the most ancient part just the first part, sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. Isn't that portion the most ancient? Or is it the whole thing that Moses sings?
No, that's part of it.
But it's not the most ancient part?
It really begins. The first part of the song actually is Ajashir Moshe V'nei Yisrael Ashira Hazot. That's this song. It begins Ladonai Hazot Ladonai, actually to God. And it says Vayamru Le'emor. Nah, that's still part of it. They said is really still part of it. Vayamru Le'omer means they said. They said. It really begins Ashira Ladonai Ki Ga'oga. I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. That's the beginning of the song. That is the beginning that's the way the song begins. And guess what? That is what it says in verse in verse 20. Shiru Ladonai ki ga'oga. It says, I will sing to God. So it literally is the same words that Miriam begins her song with. I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. So it only quotes the first line because everybody knows the song. And by the way, it also is the basis for Psalm 118, which also has that some of the same language repeated in it. So, but it's, again, we'll look at it when we read the Midrash on it, but it says, it says,
Sorry to jump in.
it says you made the wind blow, you blow, your nostrils blow, and you split the sea. I mean, that's the actual word that it says. It says, it says, the actual line is, where's the blowing out of his nose? At the blast of your nostril, uvaruach apecha, from the blast, from the wind of your nose, the waters piled up. I mean, that's a pretty anthropomorphic vision of God blowing the ocean and blowing people away. So, look, it's definitely poetry. I mean, I don't want to say that they believe that God
But the
blew
beginning
his
of Exodus,
nose.
I mean, Genesis is the same. God speaks and his breath goes out and creates.
Yep. And this is
It's pretty
the
poetic.
devastation of God's breath.
Maybe that's where COVID came from when he blew his nose.
Bad mind, Mac.
Sorry.
Bad.
God's nose. Well, anyways, I just want everybody to know that as we talked, GameStop went down 100 points today. I don't know what that means. I don't have any. I have no shares in GameStop, but I want to tell you that is in itself one of the strangest stories of. I can't wait for that movie to be made. Anyways, it literally went down 100 points.
Thank you.
Anyways, everybody, take care. Stay healthy, everybody. Be well. Be well. Be safe.